Since the launch of the PlayStation 5 Pro, we've seen a variety of patches and game upgrades. Some good, some not so good, and we've been kind of holding some of the better ones to last. And as always, we're interested to see what Guerrilla Games has been cooking. A tech studio at Sony that always makes something amazing. And looking at the patches today for Horizon Forbidden West and Remastered, we've got Oliver McKenzie. How you doing there, Oliver?
Yes, Alex, yet another PS5 Pro video. Finally, and yet another video with you, so it should be a fun one today, taking a look at Horizon.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because in the past, they've always kind of been using the checkerboard solution for a lot of their games, and we have PSSR now with PlayStation 5 Pro, and Guerrilla notably are doing something different here, and that's kind of what makes it an interesting title, along with a couple other things that you can probably talk about. So, Oliver, this is a lot of your work here, so I'm just going to hand it off to you.
Yeah. So I kind of want to start off by talking about the old performance mode versus the new performance pro mode on PS5 Pro, because I think that was probably my preferred way to play on PS5 before. Because it gave you pretty decent image quality, at least as of the patch in the summer of 2022. You get good image clarity, a little bit more breakup maybe than I'd like sometimes, but it used an 1800p checkerboard setup there with DRS, so you're not always getting that full 1800p. But it did look pretty good, I thought, on PlayStation 5. But if you move over to Performance Mode on PS5 Pro, the new Performance Pro mode, it's just so good. I think I said that image quality was best in show in September when we saw the PS5 Pro previewed. I think that's still true here. When we look at the still shots, we see the biggest divergence, I would say, in foliage, because Horizon is full of dense animated foliage. It stretches way into the distance. You get a really impressive sense of scale there, and the level of detail transitions are really handled in quite an elegant way there. They did not mesh so well with checkerboarding. It had constant aliasing and it was shimmering not so well. Again, at a normal viewing distance, maybe these things don't stand out, but if you're looking close at the screen like I am here, it does stand out here. On PS5 Pro, that's really cleaned up very effectively. It's anti-alias super well. It also appears sharper. You can make up more of those fine details in the leaves there. And it has almost like a super sampled kind of look where you get all that nice sub-pixel detail, and it really looks good. The foliage really looks nice. The opaque geometry also looks better. Again, you get that kind of great combination of greatly reduced aliasing and very high temporal stability there, and better detail as well. You see more detail in textures. Horizon has quite a lot of textures with like lots of high frequency detail, and the Pro is pulling it off better than the base PS5 there. Another area where the base console was really struggling was with screen space reflections, because you could make out kind of blocky chunks in it from the checkerboarding process. Basically, anytime the water is like moving quickly or the camera is moving, you see this kind of checkerboard pattern. On Pro, you basically don't get any of those issues. The SSR looks fine. Not exceptional, but no real issues there related to that upsampling process. Depth of field also suffered quite a bit, I'd say. Like when I enable the weapon wheel here, looks super shimmery, super unstable. That looks way better with the new reconstruction. Again, checkerboarding is causing some issues there. In the new reconstruction solution, we don't have those issues. If you kind of move through the scene, I think you see bigger issues as well. Like you start moving through the scene, it starting to break up a lot on elements like the foliage. Anti-aliasing the image in motion gets kind of very challenging with checkerboarding, and it doesn't look so great there. And yeah, if you look at Aloy, her body appears clear here. It's not perfect on either machine, but it looks quite a bit better on Pro, I would say. And also, when you start swinging around and you start moving and doing really complex movement, the background area is clearer and doesn't take a few frames to clear up when you get that kind of disocclusion issue.
Right.
So it's treating that in a more elegant way, I would say. Maybe checkerboarding is not an ideal reconstruction solution relative to some of the more flexible techniques that we have today. Sometimes it fails to even address aliasing at rest. And you can even spot, like I noticed I could spot moments when the internal resolution would change, which is kind of maybe a signal that upsampling solution is maybe not working as we'd like it to, because ideally you'd be obscuring those changes in internal resolution quite effectively. There's probably some component of that that's just higher resolution rendering, because half res 1800p checkerboard, that's about 2.9 million pixels, and the new solution is going to about 1440p on average in my counts here. There does seem to be dynamic resolution here, which is about 3.7 million pixels. It's kind of tough to count, but on cutscene camera cuts and things like that, you can get a sense of what the internal resolution is there.
Right.
It looks like it's about 1440p typically. But the new solution here just seems like way better at resolving a stable image than that old CBR rendering there in general. And it's so good that it actually stands up to, I would say, point blank scrutiny, where I can look right up against a 4K TV, as I did during that September preview event. I can really get my face up in there and not really notice any problems, which is super, super unusual for a modern title. You really do not notice that in modern graphically complex titles. The only slight pain point I would say is that it can ghost like just a tiny bit with foliage sometimes. It's not really noticeable usually, but in certain conditions it can look like a little bit like almost over accumulated there a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then I also noticed a little bit of like trails on particles sometimes, but really pretty minimal. What do you think, Alex?
I mean, based on everything you showed in the video, Oliver sent me a lot of footage of his coverage here. It looks fantastic. It looks way better than the checkerboard rendering. The checkerboard rendering that Guerrilla always used in the past was interesting because it forwent, if that's proper, the kind of hardware in the PlayStation 5 and PS4 Pro, and subsequently the PS5 Pro, that it was specially made for checkerboard rendering, this ID buffer stuff, and these hint or helper buffers that essentially allowed at full resolution to figure out where objects were on screen more gracefully. And they didn't want to use that for performance reasons back in the day for PS4 Pro. They technically could have maybe started using it later on, but they actually preferred their own solution in terms of quality and performance at the end, which didn't use it. But checkerboard rendering, like you showed off with the SSR, the reason why checkerboard rendering isn't so good at the end of the day is because it leaves this ordered grid of missing information across the entire screen. And anything that was done pre checkerboard resolve will have this ordered grid of holes in it. So things like post-processing, SSR as a post-process effect, technically would affect things like SSAO. You showed it off really well also with the depth of field, where depth of field also starts to become squished because it has to be like transformed into a 16:9 image at the end. And it has a lot of these knock-on effects. And I think it's really great to show off just how a modern, non-checkerboarded, even like, it's really important to emphasize right here, this is not PSSR, this is not Sony PlayStation Spectral Resolution. It is something that Guerrilla made for themselves. And we don't know exactly what it is. It's different than their old solutions of the past. It's some form of temporal technique, but it's one that I would love to learn more about, given the quality you're showing on screen here. But that is compared to the performance mode of PlayStation 5. With the pitch for PlayStation 5 Pro, Cerny and a number of other kind of figureheads since then have talked about it's bringing bridging the gap between quality mode on the old PS5 and bring it up to performance level standards in terms of frame rate. So how does this look on the PlayStation 5 Pro versus the old quality mode, that fidelity mode that targets 30 FPS?
Yes. I think here basically we see a lot of the same patterns, but just not taken as far, because the resolution mode before looked pretty great, I thought. If you look at the foliage, for instance, in the resolution mode, it still suffers from like a bit of flickering. The silhouettes of the trees here are kind of moving and aliasing a little bit when the image is moving. The difference can be pretty stark in Horizon just because of how fine that foliage detail is and how far it stretches into the distance here. The foliage in the base console is perhaps a little bit more responsive to updates than on the PlayStation 5 Pro there, and it doesn't ghost, but it's also not effectively anti-aliased a lot of the time. So especially when you look at elements like blades of grass that might only be like a couple pixels wide or something, it's just not doing a very good job of anti-aliasing those elements. Anytime you kind of move through the scene or look at it, you can spot that aliasing. Again, it's not that big of an issue on a 4K TV from a normal viewing distance, but it is noticeable, even if it is hugely improved from launch. And that's where the new reconstruction solution, I think, just nails it here. It does a great job of cleaning up all that super fine geometry like the ropes in the ship here, and it kind of blows past any aliasing that we might have had before. I will say, though, that the old solution is a little bit sharper, I would say. It has slightly better screen space reflections as well, which could just be because it's coming from a higher resolution. It's like often native 4K in that old resolution mode. And they do look a little bit more coherent and a little bit higher detail than the new Performance Pro mode. But overall, I would definitely prefer the new Performance Pro mode's image quality to the old quality mode. It's the kind of distinction that you might expect from like other upsamplers on PC, in particular DLSS, to some degree FSR2 as well, in quality mode, where on some image elements you're getting that kind of super sampled look that comes from those techniques there. And of course, the fact that it's running at twice the frame rate of that base game, it's a huge, huge improvement. But there's also, interestingly, a Favor Resolution Pro mode on PS5 Pro here, which runs at 30 FPS. And I did some comparisons there. The primary difference here is that the resolution internally is a bit higher. It's like coming in at native 4K, in my counts at least. But interestingly, it's not a clear upgrade because in motion, sometimes it can actually alias a little bit more, which maybe is just because it has less temporal data to work with there. It does look a little bit sharper, but I'd say maybe the biggest difference is those screen space reflections, again, where you do get more detail in the Resolution Pro mode here. But in general, you know, go with the Performance Pro mode. You're giving up so little for twice the frame rate. Very, very minor differences. And as one of the guys from Guerrilla told me back at that PlayStation Pro event, friends don't let friends play at 30 hertz. You know, I think it's a big improvement, that doubled refresh. I think the game does play a lot better. In terms of frame rates here, did want to touch on frame rates before we talk about PC, but just like Horizon on PS5, the frame rate is basically perfect here with VSync running normally at 60 hertz here. In one super intense fight, I got it to drop like a 1 frame in one instance, and another frame at one other time, but it was just like super minor in that Performance Pro mode. It's otherwise perfect. It does drop a frame on camera cuts, which is pretty normal. Does not really noticeable at 60 FPS, but a little bit more noticeable at 30 there. And the 30 FPS mode, the Resolution Pro mode, does basically run at a locked 30 FPS there as well, so it doesn't drop any frames during gameplay that I could see in some of these more demanding fights in Burning Shores, which is more demanding generally than the base game in my experience. If you want to, you can also unlock the frame rate, which is enabled by turning on 120 hertz in VRR. There's not a formal toggle for it, it just turns on. But it's not really transformative here. Like in some games that rely on a fixed resolution and you get that kind of variable refresh there, you can get a pretty nice improvement, like in the Last of Us titles, for instance. But in games that are really heavily calibrating that dynamic resolution in order to hit 16.67 milliseconds or 33.33 milliseconds, not going to make as much of a difference sometimes here. And that certainly seemed to be the case here in the Performance Pro mode, where it's kind of going up to like 70 FPS-ish in light scenes. The biggest difference I noticed was that in the more demanding content, it can actually go below 60 FPS, but that's not a bad behavior necessarily because we've got VRR here, so it's cleaned up nicely, and you're probably getting, you know, a disproportionately higher resolution in those sequences. Yeah, because it's not having to always stay above 60. It can say, we're going to go to 58 or 57 if we need to, and we're not going to touch the res as much. So that might help a little bit on the margins, but I could really take it or leave it here. It's basically the same either way. Critically, though, this only seems to affect the Performance Pro mode. The other modes in the game don't unlock when you have 120 hertz and VRR enabled, just the Performance Pro mode. I also finally tested the balance mode. Guerrilla packs a lot of modes into these games. Yeah, I don't blame them. I don't blame them for that normally, but here it does seem kind of superfluous. But again, I do like that Performance Pro mode. But if you have the system set to 120 hertz output, basically you get a 40 FPS balanced mode. And judged by eye here, it just seems like a bit of a different compromise, slightly different compromise perhaps between performance and image quality, but still using the same reconstruction solution. My advice there again would be the Performance Pro mode is the way to go here. It looks almost identical, runs about 50% faster. It's a superb visual experience, and compared to all these solutions here, I'd say that Performance Pro mode, either with VSync or with VRR, your choice, your pick, with 120 hertz and VRR, it's good either way. It really is the ideal way to enjoy this game, which I think is still probably one of the best looking games on consoles for sure. I think it still looks superb. It's doing some things in terms of the just detail level of that environment that you don't really see in hardly any other game these days. So it's a really impressive experience, and very, very impressive on PS5 Pro in that Performance Pro mode in particular.
Yeah, I mean, just like on PC, I would, especially if someone's targeting 4K like this year, I would pretty much never recommend going for native resolution if you're using something like DLSS, because you're kind of wasting power. You're getting, depending upon the game, extremely negligible differences between like DLSS quality mode or just native resolution rendering there. Yeah, I would also wholly recommend this performance mode here. And so everything you're describing sounds really good, and much better image quality than the base console. Good performance, which is expected given how this game already performed really well. But this is one of those rare opportunities where there is a good PC version here, generally from Nixxes Studio. How does this solution from Guerrilla Games compare to the PC heavy hitters of FSR2 and DLSS?
Yeah, so that DLSS comparison is kind of like the real meaty prize here. Of course, we are operating, I would caveat what I'm about to say here, with operating from 1440p internal resolution. This is not the most challenging of upscale scenarios for a lot of solutions here. So, you know, the fact that we're getting such good results is maybe something you could expect from other solutions as well. But certainly when I did compare it to DLSS, it really is remarkably similar. I would really struggle to tell these apart. The foliage presentation looks extremely close. Both resolve great looking foliage. One difference here is that DLSS has a little bit less of an issue with trails with particles. I noticed that. Where Guerrilla's reconstruction solution sometimes shows little tiny trails that's just faintly noticeable, but DLSS really doesn't. At least, you know, modern DLSS, modern DLLs does not really exhibit that issue too badly here at all. But one difference in favor of Guerrilla's solution is that the screen space reflections are smoother and don't suffer from any obvious aliasing, whereas the reflections from DLSS have those kind of checkerboard-ish patterns in them again, blocky patterns.
Yeah, it's weird.
I don't know what's going on there. Maybe the game is presenting it in a way that DLSS doesn't like. Obviously, Nvidia has some guidance about that. Also, sometimes DLSS can look a little bit messier than the Guerrilla reconstruction solution in motion, a little bit. But it's tough here because for these comparisons, I've had to dial the motion blur in on PC to a setting that matches the console, because the consoles, even when you turn off motion blur as I have here, there is still just a touch of motion blur, which is a bit of a devil for pulling out pixel counts. And it's also just a little bit weird and a little slightly frustrating because you can't really get that pure raw looking image that we really want for some of these comparisons. You're still dealing with a little bit of motion blur there, unfortunately. Yeah, unfortunate.
Recommendation to Guerrilla here is actually allow people to turn off motion blur. It still is actually noticeable. Like I'd say, like it's not like one of those things where you have to like stop the video to notice motion blur's on. If you just watch a cutscene, it's pretty obvious actually. Or if you just spin Aloy around like you're showing here. So this is a note to Guerrilla. Please actually let people turn off motion blur. If it says motion blur off, well, let it actually be off.
There's also AMD's FSR as a solution. I think it might be FSR3 here. Is it FSR3 or FSR2?
I think it was upgraded to FSR3 actually. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
And Nixxes upgraded all their titles to FSR 3.1 at some point, I believe. So yeah.
Yeah. And there are a few key differences here, I would say. So FSR tends to sometimes accumulate almost a little bit too much on the foliage, and it blurs it a bit in stills, like with the grass here. It also tends to suffer from more obvious issues with the trails that we noted before. It's also a bit soft. Now I've turned off sharpening for these comparisons, but DLSS actually looks pretty sharp even when I have that post-process sharpening dialed to 0, whereas FSR is like a little dull there. But I think overall, like FSR is giving you a good result here. Like I wouldn't be upset if they moved to FSR in lieu of checkerboarding here for PS5 Pro users. That wouldn't upset me too much here. But it's clear that whatever Guerrilla is doing here is giving you a bit of a better result than FSR. Pretty comparable to DLSS, kind of trades off in different factors, although exactly how much those are the fault of DLSS versus, you know, certain things that are being fed into DLSS is harder to say. But yeah, I mean, overall, it's a very, very good experience. I mean, at any viewing distance, literally face right up, face full of pixels, seeing individual little RGB stripes in your display there. You're gonna get basically an almost perfect image from this title. If you're sitting back at a normal viewing distance, it's gonna look absolutely pristine. So yeah, I mean, I can't fault Guerrilla at all here. They did a great job. Yeah, it's just a fantastic experience, I'd have to say.
Yeah, I would also agree based upon all the material you sent me. And I think on like a holistic level above this game, it actually does kind of beg the question about why they did it this way. Like when the camera's at rest here and there's a lot of foliage, you just know that you could get right up there and it's like a perfect beautiful image. I don't think we would be able to say the same thing always with all the PSSR implementations we've seen, especially with regards to foliage, which you've talked about in a couple titles before in your videos, Oliver. So I do kind of wonder if they really went with their own solution because they weren't happy with what they could have otherwise alternatively done. But one thing that I hope is that regardless of that Guerrilla shares some of this information internally with other studios, because yes, it's operating at a high internal resolution, but it led to a very good result in a game that is otherwise, without anti-aliasing, probably extremely messy looking, if you know what I mean. Like, there's a lot of super high frequency detail in this game that's always moving, and they managed to clean it up extremely well. So let's hope they share that information with other studios. But Oliver, I think that's the end of this video. What do you say?
Yeah, as we're just winding down here, Alex, I think like PSSR for sure has its issues. Like in some games, like The Last of Us Part 1, it looks pretty good when you're presenting certain kinds of content to it, certain kinds of resolutions to it. Looks really good, but then you dial up the content complexity, throw in ray tracing, ray traced lighting in there, push down the input resolution, and you see like really some strange results here. So we don't have a direct point of comparison here with this new upsampling technique, to be fair. We've only got like, one game at relatively high resolutions versus some other titles, some of which are not operating at very high resolutions and have RTGI and other things that can mess up PSSR to some degree, at least based on what we've seen so far. But yeah, it does seem interesting to me. I certainly hope that they are in some level of communication with the other studios at Sony, because I think the solution they have here is really, really good. Certainly I'm excited to see what they do with it in upcoming projects, because they did say to me that they had developed this basically for upcoming projects, and then they had backported it back to the Horizon games, the older Horizon titles. So perhaps we could see it deployed in a future Horizon game. There's also some question about exactly how they're doing this, if there is a machine learning component at some stage of the process. We're not aware of that at the moment, or possibly if it could be brought to PS5. I'm not sure. Maybe it's very compute heavy, maybe it's very bandwidth heavy, maybe it wouldn't translate that well to PS5. Maybe their checkerboarding solution is better, but perhaps, who knows, maybe it could end up on PS5 there at some point. I also did take a look at Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered, which I had so much capture to do for Horizon Forbidden West, and it's such a big game. I only did a little bit on Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered, but it looks substantially similar from what I can tell. And I did a quick test of the modes and quick test of the options there. It seems to operate in a very similar manner to Forbidden West there. So I would expect a substantially similar result across the run of play there, which is what we also saw from the base game on PS5. It was quite comparable to Forbidden West in a lot of respects. But yeah, I think that's probably going to do it for today. So if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, press the bell for those YouTube notifications, which may or may not occur, as Rich always says. You can check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, you can check us out on social media. But thank you, Alex,
of course,
for your insights today. And Alex, I think we should close with
Auf Wiedersehen.